So this is the third lecture on Beowulf. Um, I will have a fourth lecture to finish the poem and a kind of discussion, further discussion based upon Tolkien's commentary of Beowulf. But I wanted to pick up where I left off. If you recall, I left off in the last lecture introducing Grendel's mother coming back um, um, to avenge the death of her son Grendel. But I wanted to talk first about the essay assignment that I posted yesterday on Beowulf. Basically, the the paper asks you to uh, to introduce Beowulf's formal boast, which is probably the most important or one of the most important aspects of um, the sorry, I'm not in the middle here. Probably the most important aspect of the poem Beowulf. Um, I just want to uh, make it clear that um, the point of the boast is not to articulate a promise that he will kill Grendel. And this is a very important point for understanding the pagan Norse warrior code, which again Tolkien describes as a kind of courage or unyielding will against chaos, against the monsters representing chaos and representing uh, um, uh, the unpeace that does harm and destruction to a culture. The pagan Norse warrior code, articulates an idea of courage that acknowledges death as a very real possibility. This is important to recognize that the poem understands and articulates this as the center of the code itself. Beowulf comes to defeat Grendel or die trying, and the acknowledgement of death, the possibility of death, is the thing that's, I think, secures for Beowulf his particular standing, and the acknowledgement of the possibility of death. I don't think you can call it humility, but it's the sense that gives pagan Norse courage its integrity, its power, what Tolkien called the permanent value of pagan piety. So, as you're writing this paper, you should be clear about the center of that boast, articulating courage not as a promise of victory, but as a promise to die trying. Mortality, in other words, is at the center of that boast. Death is at the center of that boast, as it seems to be pretty much the theme of the entire poem. So we can again talk about this on Tuesday morning in my office hours. But when you're seeking then other passages to link to this boast, you should ask yourself, are there how does Beowulf go about this? What does the acknowledgement of death as a possibility gain Beowulf. Are there other places where Beowulf does not fully acknowledge death? And the answer to that is yes. It occurs when he faces the dragon in the final scenes of the poem, which I think I'll postpone that lecture and a further commentary to another posting. But the again, just to recall the point that 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 Grendel represents fratricide, represents the possibility of the pagan culture, the pagan warrior code turning against itself. It's very hard to shut the valve off of vengeance, and the possibility of that form of vengeance being directed inward shows the crisis of the culture, really, right? If you've got a principle that in effect is supposed to maintain the culture, right? Kill your enemy who has killed your kin. And if that vengeance winds up actually without any outside enemy, winds up leading to the killing of kin, well, then its very purpose is defeated, right? The whole point of the code is to defend kin. So anger, vengeance has this destructive quality, and it's symbolized in the death of Grendel, right? The attempt to just break the arm off, right? Well, I want to suggest that, breaking the arm off without, remember, Beowulf promises not to use arms in his fight against Grendel. I'm not sure if I made that very clear. There's a promise he will not use arms. That point is to show that he's going to stand up against whatever this looks like, however this becomes articulated, right? It's seen in symbols, shadowy symbols, that in the defeat of Grendel. It's facing that thing without using arms. So to break off the arm is to break off that which secures vengeance and its inward movement against your kin. But of course, it's just the arm. Grendel's mother coming back. This requires a further deeper kind of resistance that we'll find in the defeat of Grendel's mother. So Grendel comes back and kills a retainer. It happens to be Aesir, one of Hrothgar's most trusted counselors. The monster's character is articulated at 1355. Fatherless creatures, their whole ancestry is hidden in a past of demons and ghosts. There's that idea of a halcyon, takes a kind of human form, physical form, but also a spiritual power. So Grendel's mother and Grendel live in swamps. The symbolism of this, they live in meres, right? The symbolism of this is that they're outside of habitation. They live in some treacherous place that is haunted, the kind of wilderness. The Beowulf poet says, very matter-of-factly, that is no good place, right? Haney translates that is no good place. So what does it symbolize? It symbolizes that there's, it kind of links with the Cain. Cain became an outcast for killing his brother. But it symbolizes this alien force, right? That seems to inhabit men when they give themselves up to this code. Beowulf to Hrothgar's best counselor being killed is at 1383, and this shows again the difference between Beowulf and what would be a Christian viewpoint. Um, this might be a good passage to compare in a paper. Wise sir, Beowulf, son of Ecgtheow, spoke. Wise sir, do not grieve. It is always better to avenge dear ones than to indulge in mourning. So there's the code. It's better to avenge dear ones than indulge in mourning. For every one of us, living in this world means waiting for our end. There's the other part of the code, right? The other part of the code is the possibility of death, right? That we're all hemmed in by death. Let whoever can win glory before death. So again, this sense of gaining glory, the desire for glory, of victory, of victory, but also of courage, not necessarily of victory. When a warrior is gone, that will be his best and only bulwark. Notice no mention of heavenly reward. It's only his memory. So arise, my lord, and let's immediately set forth on the trail of this troll dam. I guarantee you she will not get away, not to dens underground, nor upland groves, nor the ocean floor. She'll have nowhere to flee. Endure your troubles today. Bear up and be the man I expect you to be. So, this sense of again, of impending doom, of death, of of glory won before death, of no succor afterward. That's the center of this code. Beowulf girds for battle. He takes the blade called hrunting, Hrunting. If you know anything about Tolkien, you know that many blades are named. He steals this, of course, from pagan Norse culture, and perhaps Beowulf. The name of this sword, it is described at 1459. The iron blade with its ill-boding patterns had been tempered in blood. It had never failed the hand of anyone who hefted it in battle, anyone who had fought and faced the worst in the gap of danger. This was not the first time it had been called to perform heroic feats. Very important. This never failed. It will fail at this point. It's also no accident that the sword is given to him by Unferth. Remember that not only does Beowulf accuse Unferth of killing his kin, but the poet, which I didn't mention, in 1165, the poet also says that Unferth has a cloud of suspicion over him. The forthright Unferth, admired by all for his mind and courage, although under a cloud for killing his brothers, reclined near the king. So that cloud of suspicion, I think, is not just from Beowulf. Beowulf must have heard that. Remember, Beowulf says this to him, but he must have gotten some intelligence about this, as he comes into Denmark. So the killing of Grendel's mother has a kind of mythological or somewhat, I would say, symbolic meaning. He goes under the mere, under the lake, for 9 hours. And so that going under is clearly not literal. It's a symbolic going under. I mentioned the phrase agon as I was introducing this poem in the first lecture. Agon. It's a literary term to describe a kind of suffering or going under a kind of purgation of sorts. Beowulf's suffering has that form. He takes something on himself and carries it with him, and then for the culture itself, it's a symbolic of a kind of spiritual struggle or kind of internal struggle. So Beowulf, this place, right? Beowulf's mother, the chambers are lighted by a gleam and flare up. It's more a gloomy kind of illumination, not heated, right? So in his battle with Beowulf's mother, the sword fronting fails him. At 1524, it failed the man in his need. The fabulous powers of heirloom failed. 1528. So Beowulf tosses the sword. And this is also important, I think, and symbolic, what he does here. This is at lines 1531. Then in a fury he flung his sword away. The keen inlaid worm-looped patterned steel was hurled to the ground. He would have to rely on the might of his arm. So must a man do who tends to gain enduring glory in combat. Life doesn't cost him a thought. So he hand-to-hand combat. And again, the sense of glory as going for the fight and not backing down. He's protected by the mail shirt and fate. This is at 1550. The son of Ecgtho would have surely perished, and the Geats lost their warrior under the wide earth, had the strong links and locks of his war gear not helped to save him. Holy God decided the victory. Again, that's an addition from the Christian poet. Beowulf is not aware of that. It was easy for the Lord, the ruler of heaven, to redress the balance once Beowulf got back up on his feet. So the sense that for the poet, this is an indication of God's providence. Beowulf would see this as fate. This is the place where fate, and for the pagan, and Almighty God's providence and work intervening dovetail, come together in a way. How does Beowulf kill Grendel's mother? Well, he finds a giant sword and uses it to kill her at 1557 to 69. And then the blade melts, and this is an interesting passage. The brave shieldings it's not work. Meanwhile, the sword began to wilt into gory icicles to slather and thaw. It was a wonderful thing the way it all melted as ice melts when the Father eases the fetters off the frost and unravels the water ropes. He who wields power over time and tide. He is the true Lord. Again, this poet not always, but frequently taking the chance to use references to God, to show that even in pagan times, this sense of God's purpose was always present, watching over even the pagans. But the blade melts, right? He sticks it into Grendel's mother, and the blade melts itself. Beowulf emerges after 9 hours, returns with Grendel's mother's head, and recounts the battle, how Hrunting failed, but how the sword worked. And I'll read a passage from 1659. Although Hrunting is hard-edged, I could never bring it to bear in battle. But the Lord of men allowed me to behold, for he often helps the unbefriended, an ancient sword shining on the wall, a weapon made for giants, there for the wielding. Then my moment came in the combat, and I struck the dwellers in that den. Next thing, the Damascene sword blade melted. It bloated and it burned in their rushing blood. I have wrested the hilt from the enemy's hand, avenge the evil done to the Danes. It is what was due. And this I pledge, O Prince of the Shieldings, you can sleep secure with your company of troops in Heorot Hall. I would suggest to you the symbolism is almost impossible to miss. That in some way Beowulf, in facing the killer, and facing this force, right, and facing down vengeance, which leads to the killing of kin, he has destroyed with the enemy's own sword this sense, this idea of, or this impulse to fratricide. So again, having killed with its own sword, this is what happens. Vengeance kills itself. Vengeance ultimately will kill itself. And Beowulf, in somehow facing that, facing it down, has at least at this point, has stayed that impulse. So I think this is pretty clear when you recognize what's on the blade. Hrothgar spoke. He examined the hilt, that relic of old times. It was engraved all over and showed how war first came into the world and the flood destroyed the tribe of giants. They suffered a terrible severance from the Lord. Right? So what's the sword itself is a symbol of murder and war and destruction. And somehow in Beowulf, in using that sword, has destroyed the work of it. So I want to read Tolkien's commentary on this passage, which I think is highly illuminating. He says, the whole of this passage is very important for the general criticism of Beowulf. It's a passage describing the ancient sword hilt that is most interesting and important, especially with reference to the dating of Beowulf and the blending and fusion of scripture and pagan northern legend. The archaeological interest is only secondary, for if no swords with runic inscriptions naming their owners had ever been found, the poet plainly describes one, and has a connection between the Eotenus of the north and the Gigantes of scripture that is really significant. Right? And again, the significance is the way in which Cain's clan, the Old Testament, the severance, the introduction of war, and how it severs human beings from the Lord, from the Almighty in the Old Testament, dovetails with the sense of fratricide and war, and the way the whole thing comes together to undermine this culture of vengeance. So it's interesting that Beowulf is praised by Hrothgar. Hrothgar praises God at 1778. So I praise God in his heavenly glory that I live to behold this head dripping blood, and that after such howling I can look upon it in triumph at last. Take your place then with pride and pleasure, and move to the feast. Tomorrow morning our treasure will be shared and showered upon you. So Beowulf is praised, Beowulf is rewarded, Beowulf gets glory, God gets some credit in this. Again, Hrothgar is a man who seems to have a kind of theological acuity, even though he's a pagan. And as the other thing that he does, though, is he warns Beowulf he warns Beowulf of pride, against pride. So um, find this passage. O flower, this is at 1758. O flower of warriors, beware of that trap. And it was a story he had just told of Hermod to warn Beowulf to not fall into pride. Choose, dear Beowulf, the better part, eternal rewards. Do not give way to pride. For a brief while your strength is in bloom, but it fades quickly, and soon there will follow illness or the sword to lay you low, or a sudden fire or surge of water or jabbing blade, or javelin from the air, or repellent age. Your piercing eye will dim and darken, and death will arrive, dear warrior, to sweep you away. And then he even blames Grendel and Grendel's mother for as a punishment that he himself succumbed to pride. Grendel struck after laying in wait, he laid waste to the land. From that moment, my mind was in dread of his depredations. So this sense of pride is worrisome enough that Hrothgar will takes it upon himself to warn him. Now, this I want to suggest to you that this has its place in pagan culture. Remember, that's pride. Pride is I'm going to win. Pride is not courage. Pride is rashness. Courage is the acknowledgement of possible defeat and death. Pride does not acknowledge the possibility of death. And we see this as a pivot, right? If you don't believe you're going to die, well, anything, all bets are off. Or if you just don't acknowledge it, all bets are there, right? So you begin to see the thinking or the logic of pride, right? It not only thinks it can defeat an enemy, but it comes back to the clan and takes no account of other people. So its pride becomes a kind of murdering instinct. I might as well knock off a few kin too. What does it matter? There's something like Odysseus's pride here. Something very much like Odysseus's pride, I think. So the commentary of Beowulf on this whole discourse, what's called Hrothgar's discourse, is important, I think. And I'm going to read passages from Tolkien's commentary. Paul Hrothgar's sermon. This is what he says. In this we have Christian, virtually medieval motives woven together with the pagan exemplum of Hermod. The use of Hermod as a dark contrast, a caution by Hrothgar, links together the praise after the second deed with that after the first, where Hermod is also introduced. So it links back with the praise heaped upon Beowulf after Grendel, after the boast. The Christian part of the sermon is very interesting, Tolkien says. It serves to complete, before we finally part from him, the portrait of the patriarchal Hrothgar. But as we shall see, it raises in very special and acute fashion the questions: A, whether our Beowulf has been tinkered with since it was composed, that is, touched up by another poet. I'm not speaking of mere scribal corruption and copying. B, whether it was known and imitated by other poets still extant. C, whether Cynewulf is concerned in either or both of the two preceding processes. Cynewulf is another medieval writer. On the question of the fusion of scripture and northern mythology, of Cain, Grendel, and the giants, I have already said what I think in The Monsters and the Critics. And again, go back to my lecture. I gave a clear account of that, right? That point of contact is the evil that both the Old Testament figures who prefigure Christianity and these pagan warriors, they're both allied against evil, although there's no sense of the resurrection. So that comes together there. The main scriptural source of the reference to giants is Genesis 6:4. Tolkien doesn't mention this, but that would have been that was one of the first things translated into Old English by a writer named Alfred. But as I have said elsewhere, the main defect in our criticism is ignorance of the native mythology. In Old English, we have nothing to go on save these same scant and already blended references which we are trying to understand. So the poem itself is the source of the problem. Outside, we have chiefly Old Norse. I do not doubt that English tradition agreed in what one might call the philosophical principle with Old Norse, the essential hostility of the monsters, even those in more or less human form, giants and trolls, to the humane or human divine. We've seen that again. But of its more specific details which would help to explain the fusion, we are ignorant. He says it's lost. So, again, an interesting way of thinking about the way this discourse fits with fuses pagan piety, the resistance to evil despite the fact that one will die facing it, and the Old Testament elements that the Christian would have been aware of. Yet there is all the same, Tolkien goes on to say, something odd here. Blending is naturally again observable. We have the purely Germanic northern story of Heremod alluded to, with special reference here to his unprincely crime of greed. He gave not things of gold unto the days to earn him praise. Bad lord, right? He keeps all the gold to himself. This is merely neatly paralleled later in the picture of the generalized fortunate man destroyed by pride, and success corrupted into avarice. His grim heart fills with greed. In no wise doth he deal gold-plated rings to earn him praise. So again, the idea of greed and perhaps the killing of kin, these both come from a person who is used to victory and has put death out of his mind. If you think of death, you're not going to do these two things. By the way, recall this because Beowulf seems to succumb in some way to dragon lust and the lust for gold. That's all symbolic too, but he succumbs to pride, Beowulf does. Although it would be possible to view this as produced by a homiletic interpolator expanding the moral, I do not personally doubt that the homiletic elaboration of the moral is mainly due to the author, that the same hand wrote both and designed them to echo one another. So Tolkien is arguing the Beowulf poet wrote this moral into it. There are, however, two things to note. Firstly, a point that does not in itself prove any tinkering by later hands. The sermon is artistically too long and also is not thoroughly suitable. It is too Christian in coloring for the good pre-Christian patriarch Hrothgar. This stricture applies especially to the reference to conscience, guardian of the soul, and the allegorical shafts of the evil one. Even if we accept as Beowulfian the passage, he knows nothing of worse fate. Onwards in the course of which the theme of the end of youth and fortune is further elaborated. But that is not all. There is a quite exceptionally clear, convincing, in fact, inescapable connection between Hrothgar's sermon and the Old English poem Christ. The resemblance is one both of matter and turns of expression. The author of evil sends forth a bitter shaft from his deceitful bow seems to echo Beowulf. Indeed, it would hardly be too much to say that the sermon reads and rings often more like the author of Christ than that of the author of the rest of Beowulf. The author of Christ, certainly of the runic passage, and so almost certainly what precedes it was Cynewulf. So how does this fit with this author Cynewulf who writes this poem on Christ? In these poems, there are numerous parallelisms of expression with Beowulf. From them, we can deduce no more than that Beowulf is known and admired by later poets. But the feeling that the sermon is overloaded and partly discrepant in tone and style is on quite a different footing. I do not doubt that Cynewulf knew and admired Beowulf and echoed it, and I'm perfectly certain that he did not in general read it. Um, so um, let's see if I'll conclude this passage. Thus, if we pass from the general, I think practically certain conclusion, a later author has been at work here, to the question of exact detail, what did he do? We shall not reach any clear results. It is not so much a question of interpolation, only as of actual rewriting, which might intricately blend old and new. So again, the point of contact is one which the Christian poet, from the standpoint of Christianity, sort of adds or colors the Hrothgar sermon, and shows a point of contact. Pride and greed are um, both kind of fail to acknowledge death, and so therefore um, lead to unmeasured actions, both of which, by the way, destroy the culture. Obviously, the killing of kin is a blow at the very heart of the culture, because the whole point of vengeance is to avoid having your kin killed. The other is perhaps this idea of greed, right? That will break apart the culture too. If the Lord doesn't hand out gifts to satisfy his warriors, well, that's going to create animosity. We saw that in the Odyssey. Tolkien doesn't mention this, but it was hinted at in one of his commentaries that Hrothgar's whole location of human sacrifice, perhaps a battle was fought over there. And remember that the Beowulf poet says that was their way. It's a terrible thing to resort to human sacrifice in a time of need, but they didn't know what else to do. Beowulf seems to be a figure opposed to that too. Perhaps recognizing that this is also a kind of absurd form of desperation and despair to resort to human sacrifice. And again, the point that I made in a previous lecture, that once Christ comes along on the cross, they see their human sacrifice and recognize theologically, or accept theologically, that that's the final human sacrifice necessary for atonement for sins. So you see the interesting connection here, and why this culture seems to absorb Christianity almost in the blink of an eye. And again, Tolkien, I think, is onto this thing, and is interested in this particular issue. Here ends, Tolkien says, the first part of Beowulf. What we have next is the second part. I'm going to stop here, but I just want to say one thing. I'll just read one thing from the commentary. The first part depicts the rise of Beowulf, his emergence as a full Healeth hero, his coming of age and acquisition of blade, fame, and fortune glorified by the strength and hope of youth. And it is not hinted that Beowulf escaped the temptation of blood. He did not fall into arrogance or greed. But the first part also foreshadows the coming of old age, the bitter wisdom of experience. It makes it very poignant to find the young, proud Beowulf so much like Hrothgar so soon as the link or interlude of his return home is over. The first words that he speaks are reminiscent. In youth, from many an onslaught of war, I came back safe. From many a day of battle, I do recall it all. So it sets he says the contrast of youth and age and the death inevitable sequel of youth and triumph seen in the rise, part 1, and fall, part 2 of Beowulf, is made far more vivid by thus setting youth before age and its judgment. And finally, for us, I do not doubt, also for the poet as contemporaries, the whole poem is dignified by the connection with the great Scylding court, the golden house of Heorot, glorious and doomed. It gives it what one might call an Arthurian atmosphere and background, right? So we've got the rise of Beowulf. The next is going to be the fall. I'm going to stop there because this next section is loaded with important details. But this should be enough to get you thinking deeply about the paper and the problems associated with Beowulf's boast and possible topics to write on. And again, we can talk about that on Tuesday in my office hours.